Do you have a tough challenge with your supply chain or logistics? Loguru is the intelligent partner that works globally with manufacturers, retailers, and logistics businesses. We help our customers define, buy, and safely implement solutions across the supply chain. If you want a more sustainable future for your supply chain, visit loguru.co.uk. Complete end-to-end satisfaction guaranteed.
Coming up in this episode.
I think I experienced about 250 rocket attacks in the time I was there, including a direct hit on my accommodation. And whilst at the time you sort of got on with it, that was a real challenge. And actually, I think that's when my own personal leadership was challenged the most.
The Logistics Collective podcast is a series focused on the logistics industry, where there are many incredible stories to be told. We'll be speaking with those who've worked and are working within the industry today. What have been their experiences, good and bad, since joining, and would they recommend a career in the industry to others? Here's your host, Malcolm Pope.
Hello, and welcome to our next edition of Logistics Collective, the podcast. And today I've got a true high flyer with me. Somebody that has led logistics operations in the most extreme environments, and somebody that now has an absolute abiding interest in terms of helping organisations really achieve gender balance, amongst other things. Somebody that I've just found out is studying for a doctorate. I'd like to introduce you to a wonderful woman called Debs Wright, who is founder and director of RYHALL Leadership and spent 23 years in the Royal Air Force, culminating with the role of Chief of Staff, which is all about driving RAF-wide culture and behavioural change. She's also been Officer Commanding 85th Expeditionary Logistics Wing, and she's been in operational deployments in such really pleasant and safe locations like the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan. So could I offer the warmest welcome to Debs Wright?
It is lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to coming along.
How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, I've had a bit of a break before this week and I feel quite refreshed and energised today.
Did you go anywhere special?
I stayed at home because I'm still sort of settling into my new home, but it was just nice to have a bit of a break with my husband and not have to work.
Staycations are good, actually, I think. You know,
yes.
None of the fuss and nonsense of packing. Take your time to do what we all don't do, which is actually go and understand the world around us. So, my first question to you is, now I think you are a superhero, but if you were choosing which superhero you wanted to be, what superhero, well, let's say what superhero gift would you like? What would it be?
Gosh, superhero gift. It's very easy to go, isn't it? Sort of with the being invisible or being able to fly. I think I would stick with being able to understand people. I think that's where I find my life's interest goes. And actually, I'd love it if I could just intuitively understand where everyone else is coming from as I'm talking to them and going about my business.
Is it mind reading, or is it, sort of non-verbal communication and the observations around that? Is it?
I think it's mind reading. I think it's emotions reading. I think I would love to be able to just be able to, I suppose it's the be an empath, to be able to detect people's emotions before they've spoken, before they've shown them themselves.
Now I'm going to give myself up as a Star Trek fanatic next, but there we go. You need to be an empath. You need to be Troy on Star Trek The Next Generation, but there we go.
Need to be, yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do now, and maybe let's do a little bit of the sort of flying around bit and logistics and all of that as well, if you'd be so kind. It'd be lovely if you could do that. But how have you ended up with RYHALL Leadership? What's your motivation behind that?
So RYHALL Leadership came about after I'd chosen to leave the Royal Air Force. So yeah, I will talk about my first 23-year career in a moment. And I set up RYHALL Leadership October last year. So it's very much my nascent sort of developing career. At the moment, what I do is I coach women one-to-one. They are leaders in large organisations right on the cusp of promotion to the next level, potentially going to go to the board. And they're individuals who are just torn between sandwich generations of kids and parents having dedicated decades to work, and they just need that space, that confidential area to download and think about themselves, develop their leadership, because quite often they find that their expertise that's got them promoted isn't quite what's needed for the next step up. And so with me, I can help them really look at their own leadership and develop it so that they actually stay in work and progress, rather than quite often feel as if it's just too much and leave the workplace, or say, right, I'll just take my foot off the career pedal. And I suppose what I'm wanting to do over time is to develop that. So it's not just one-to-one coaching. I want to create a whole community of women who can support one another and really focus on how we can keep women in organisations. And that passion of mine's just come from working in an organisation like the Royal Air Force that was wonderful in so many ways, but was incredibly male-dominated. And it just made me realise actually the power of getting people together for shared experiences, to realise that quite often barriers that you experience, you've internalised them, but they are there for a reason. And once you know that you've got a name for them, you can actually start to address them and break them down. And so that's why I came into in coaching one-to-one. But yes, I began my career in the Air Force. I always used to make a joke about it, sort of saying it was at the end of last century. But I began to realise that fewer and fewer people were finding that funny.
I still certainly find that funny, being a child of 1965. So, I think we trans-millennium generations are interesting. It's not just across a century, it's across a millennium. Although, to be fair, the measure is arbitrary. Before we sort of go back in the time machine, you said something really interesting there. And for me, I guess I have meritocracy in my own mind and what is right and good for the organisation. And I try, as a small business leader, I have a very, very balanced team that supports me. And I actually try to be blind as far as, this sounds like a nonsense, blind but cognizant, in terms of gender, etc. So, but the thing that really sort of chimed with me in terms of what you've said is women that are looking to get to that next level. Perhaps it's into C-suite, and you felt that there's a missing element, or there's something there that's needed. What does that tend to be?
It does tend to vary from person to person, because I think when you get to that level, actually, you sort of do know how the system operates. You generally do know your own strengths and weaknesses. You've got a lot of insight into the organisation, but there might be some behavioural issues, and I can't claim to be changing the system. I'm sort of with individuals, and quite often it's, for example, a woman will tend to minimise, and I'm grossly stereotyping here because actually I do coach men as well, and I spot this in all genders, but people will minimise the achievement that they've had. So they'll be given praise for delivering a piece of work, and they'll say, oh, thank you, but it didn't take much, or thank you, but actually so-and-so helped out, or thank you, but that's just what I do, and immediately, so they're not owning it and saying that is what I did. And so sometimes I just work with people to actually stop after thank you, or to say thank you, and I must let you know that so-and-so was a contributing factor, or thank you, and I found it took up this much time. So minimising is one thing that I work with people on, and claiming an achievement. I do find quite often that women don't claim their own achievement. They quite often have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with the word ambition. And so working with them to actually recognise that ambition it's a way of them reaching their potential to do good in the world, rather than it being something that's got a number of negative connotations to it, which could be you've got to be very egotistical, or you've got to be very pushy. And so sort of trying to dilute some of that either or thinking. And those are just two examples of sort of behaviours I think need to change. The one that I find really fascinating, though, is particularly in large organisations where individuals have become experts in a particular area and they've been promoted because they're experts. And then suddenly, when you're looking at that step to C-suite or just below, you've got to become more of a generalist. And you've got to be able to step away from being an expert in everything that you've known. And that, I think, is quite a challenge for a lot of people. And again, I look at it from a gender perspective, but I recognise not just gender. But women in particular do tend to get promoted for being experts and then are held back from actually being that generalist who can lead expert teams. And I find that very rewarding. For me, it's a difference from tactical and operational leadership to strategic leadership, and helping women consciously recognise that change in style and becoming familiar and comfortable with it is hugely rewarding, because actually that's when their real potential can get unlocked.
As a man, I'm hugely supportive in terms of we need as many inspiring leaders as we can possibly put our hands on. And if people are doing and beginning to knock down barriers, and I think the biggest thing that I've seen working with, I work with numbers of operational leaders who have been women, and they, in general, in my view, and I've said it consistently before, have been the best operational leaders I have worked with. But where I pick upon, which is an echo of what you've said, is that there's a self-doubt. There's sort of like a slight imposter syndrome within that. And for me, we need people that don't have that little nagging self-doubt. I think to be humble, that's sort of been interesting with the work that my business has done in the Middle East. They value humility beyond anything else. And I think humility is a lovely quality to have, and you have to have real strength to have humility in the constructive and positive sense I believe it's intended in there. But you can overcook it, and I think that I've had to encourage colleagues in the past to say, look, I think you're the most brilliant person at what you do.
Yeah.
Yep.
I definitely recognise that, and that quite often working with why someone feels a bit of an imposter is really helpful, whether it's that they have a bit of perfectionism in their minds, so actually they're not doing everything. Or quite often there's just a voice in their head that protected them when they were younger, but actually they need to just recognise it's not helpful. And that's a lot of what I do, is get people to look at their own behaviours, go, well, is that serving me well now? It might well have served me well 5, 10, 15 years ago. And that raising of awareness around the internal voices in the head can do so well in terms of recognising that imposter phenomena and then working with it to then actually move away from it. It's a powerful journey. But yeah, I've got to be honest, I recognise it in all genders. I've recently worked with a group of individuals who've all been promoted, and that moving upwards can get a lot of us looking internally and going, oh, did I get hit by luck? And it's like the evidence of no, you didn't.
I think, people misunderstand. We don't hand out too many awards for second prize. Yep. To get onto a shortlist is an incredible achievement, and you then come to nuances quite often in terms of choice, and it's quite often to win a role is quite often minor elements. You've got two great candidates. How do you actually make that choice? But it's more in terms of the day-to-day confidence. Winning a role is a tiny part of that role, and it's how do you actually survive and prosper in that environment.
Yeah.
So I think what you're doing is fascinating, but I'm going to be insistent because I'm sure the listeners would want to know a little bit more about Debs. And so, where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I come from a military family.
Okay.
Yes, I actually was the last generation in about 160 years of people serving in the military.
Wow.
So my father was in the Royal Air Force, as was his dad before him. So I was actually born at RAF Halton Hospital, which is no longer exists, but is in Aylesbury.
So you're truly an RAF baby then?
I am, yes.
Wow.
I travelled around with my dad. So whenever
So
anyone...
so you weren't born with the flying jacket and the moustache and... Oh, no, that's awful of me.
No, but I was definitely born with a very positive view of the military and all that it could offer. So I think that definitely helped in terms of breaking down some barriers for me.
So you're in this RAF environment. You're in the the Royal Air Force family, and so you're growing up. You're possibly moving around, I would guess. Yep.
Yeah.
But you're going through education, and then you come to a mind of career. But did you go through a few? What were your dream jobs? What were you thinking about? Was it always in the direction of I want to go into the military, or did you consider other things as well?
I always had the Royal Air Force in the background. I never wanted to join the army. I never wanted to join the Navy. But actually, my first application for the Royal Air Force was rejected.
No.
And being the person I am, I sort of thought, well, that's it. If you don't want me, I'm going to go elsewhere. And what I really...
Was there a degree of huffiness then?
There might have been a bit of flounce that went on there. I was a nerd. I was quite young at the time.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of flounce. There really, really isn't.
But the other thing I really wanted to do was join the BBC and go into radio production. I love the medium of radio, and I find it very amusing that both organisations, the BBC and the Royal Air Force, they've got these national reputations and they're very values driven. So I think I'd been happy in either. But having got over my flounce, I reapplied for the Royal Air Force, thinking I'm pretty sure that you got it wrong last time. Royal Air Force in not selecting me. I want to give you a second chance. And thankfully they agreed.
That's a wow. There's sort of like there's a sense of destiny within that. That's what I'm going to do. That's where I'm going to go.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that idea of destiny in somebody is that a key driving force for people that become successful, or are people that might have multiple destinies in their head and they can't make their mind up?
Gosh, that's an interesting one. I could almost argue both ways. Some of the most fascinating people I've ever worked with and met are still trying to find out what their purpose is, what their destiny is. And yet I've worked with other people who have a very clear idea from the outset what it is that they're on this planet to do. I think I could really narrative my story as one of destiny always going to happen. I was so comfortable in the Air Force. It was just what I wanted. But also I recognise that it almost didn't happen. I did only sign up for 6 years service initially because I thought I'd only do it for a short period of time before I grew up, and then I would go and do a proper job somewhere else. And now I look back on it, much as I loved doing it, and I had a wonderful career, I'm really happy that I've left. So I do wonder whether actually, although at the time it was right for me, you do just have to move on to each stage of your life and have those different destinies that you mentioned.
I agree. I think it's a path you follow, and every road has a beginning and an end. And then you say, new route, please.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Have you found the transition from, let's say, being in the RAF into a more civilian perspective? I mean, do you identify any differences? Or
it's been. I'm still so new into that journey. I stopped wearing uniform just over a year ago. Didn't leave the Air Force till October. It's like chalk and cheese. It really is, particularly having gone into a self-employed role. And I think it's going to be an ongoing journey for quite some time. Someone did say to me it takes a couple of years to metaphorically take the uniform off, even when you're not wearing it.
Is it that you're sort of walking around Waitrose and wondering why people aren't saluting you? Is it that sort of a feeling?
I think there's something about military service that it just gets into your blood. It gets to your soul in a way that you don't want to lose that. And I suppose that's the thing, actually, is getting comfortable with saying former Royal Air Force officer. Although I do still catch myself sort of talking about the RAF and we. Although I did have a networking meeting the other day where for the first time I didn't introduce myself as former Royal Air Force. So I thought that was sort of a step forward in my transition.
So before going into the RAF, I mean, obviously there was school, was there college or university? Or...
Yes, I went to university after A-levels and studied medieval and modern history, which was... I mean, it was a subject I enjoyed at the time, but I must admit, I don't know that I put too much time and effort into actually getting my degree. I think I've come to academic learning later on in life with the way that I really enjoy it, rather than just this is the next stage that I'm expected to go to.
I think the greatest and the best learning is that you can do by wandering around and allowing you to learn almost in a natural way. I think often I see some of our educational institutions, not all. It's equivalent to battery hens, you know.
Yeah.
There I am in my cage being force fed.
Yeah, I know we're going to get onto the Air Force, but one of the best jobs I did was where I was commanding an education unit. Yeah. And it was with very young individuals who were 17, 18 years old. And quite often at graduations, I'd meet the parents, and particularly with the young men, the parents would sort of say, "Oh, we like the Air Force because he's bright, but he just hadn't applied himself at school." And with the Air Force, you could get the qualifications at a later stage. And that's often what happened, was that individuals, they were bright, but the education system just wasn't testing them at the right point in their lives. And by coming into the Air Force, we made sure that people were doing NVQs as they were learning their job. And you could just see about 5 years later, it sort of sparked for them and they could get the qualifications.
Is it context and relevance that is the key here?
I think so much. I mean, abstract learning is not for everybody.
No.
Air movements, loading up aircraft, when you suddenly realise that actually if you don't get the arithmetic right, the aircraft could crash.
Yep.
Then you suddenly go, oh, right, now I understand what it is I'm having to do, rather than, I don't know, algebra or, whatever it is that you're up to in maths, theoretically.
Yeah. Hopefully that's by either running a program or running the numbers, not the Hercules goes up and
Preventative rather than reactionary.
Yeah, I think be a good idea, but no, I think we need to avoid my slight passion for disaster movies, really. But so, you made, by one slight diversion, you went into the RAF, and so we start then. The clock starts on your wonderful 23 career there. I mean, could you give us a brief sort of run through of that? I mean, it's so difficult to do. I mean, I talk too much. Probably everybody that listens to this says I do. What was the start, the middle, and the end, I guess?
Yeah. So if I focus on the logistics jobs I did and the real highlights, and I began in the best possible way, because having gone through a year of training, I had 3 weeks before I was then deployed off to the Balkans with a unit called Tactical Supply Wing. Which was responsible for refueling helicopters out in the battlefield. So I would spend my time around the Balkans, including Banja Luka Metal Factory, where there would be American Apaches flying around all the time. And we would have the helicopter landing sites, and I would physically be running from platform to platform with the refueling pipelines, making sure that these helicopters could stay flying. And with that unit, having done a deployment out in the Balkans. I then went out to Oman with them. I ended up going all around the country, all over the world, and just really experiencing what logistics and the last mile was all about. Following off that, I ended up going down to the Falkland Islands for a few months, and coming back and specialising in air movement. So actually working at RAF Brize Norton, really getting to grips with air cargo and passenger air freight. And that ended up with me going and living in Germany for a couple of years and helping the army deploy out to Afghanistan and Iraq, rather than coming back to the UK to deploy, actually getting them loaded up in Germany so that all of their equipment and air units could not just deploy out to operations, but do the bull-womps, so that we weren't relying on the same people constantly out in theatre. So that was an amazing job as well. And then the job I mentioned before, the squadron command job, where I was in charge of training all the air movers, that was brilliant, because actually passing on skills and expertise to a young generation coming in and seeing their enthusiasm and seeing their excitement of, I mean, the unit was literally built at the end of the runway at Brize Norton, so you could see the C-17s and the Antonov aircraft coming in. That was absolutely fantastic. And then my final job in the logistics of the Air Force was commanding the High Readiness Logistics Units of 85 Expeditionary Logistics Wings. So it was reserve units and regulars, but it was the full span of air logistics, from supply chain management to catering to surface transport, and included the mountain rescue unit as well, so that if an aircraft went down, we had the capability to find the aircraft and the people and bring them back safely. And that was an absolute privilege. I did that for 2 years during COVID. And so commanding 85 Wing was a phenomenal high to have as a career.
I could honestly talk to you for hours, but I know that we've got a limited amount of time. And what was your best career experience whilst working in the RAF? What was the pinnacle?
Gosh, I mean, just when I sort of go over those highlights there, I could almost choose any one of those. I think the work I did commanding 85 Wing to bring in genuine psychological safety, so that actually there was a culture where people could admit their mistakes and learn from them. That felt like a real high point to me. But whenever anyone talks to me about the Air Force and they want to have a sort of moment of my face really lighting up, it was that first role that I did as a junior officer out in the Balkans with Tactical Supply Wing, refueling the helicopters, because you really were at the very last mile of a logistics chain that started back in the UK, and you got the reward for your job right at that point. So that was definitely a real highlight. I loved that job.
Fantastic to hear. In terms of, we've had perhaps the yin, we're looking at the yang. What was the worst experience?
I've got to be honest, it was the tour I did out in Iraq. We were at Basra Airfield at a time when the Iraqis were attacking us on an almost hourly basis with indirect fire. So you never knew when the rockets were going to land. I think I experienced about 250 rocket attacks in the time I was there, including a direct hit on my accommodation. And whilst at the time you sort of got on with it, that was a real challenge. And actually, I think that's when my own personal leadership was challenged the most, because sometimes it did feel more like a fight for survival rather than being able to look after the rest of my team as well.
I mean, to people that are perhaps in their armchairs at home, and we've got a whole variety of people that would look, and the Iraq War was clearly broadcasting into our living rooms. Did we ever get a sense of really what it was like there?
I think the journalism did try to really get to grips with it, but it's difficult when you're living there day after day in that sort of environment to get across the genuine level of fatigue that everyone's dealing with. I think that was the hardest thing, that if you were ruling out sort of every 6 weeks, you could keep yourself fresh. But I was there for even 6 months. And I think that level of fatigue was really challenging. And I also think for me, in the role that I was in, it was the one deployment I did where I wasn't engaged with the local population, where I was very much in our own camp, which the Americans were at and the Brits were at, and that felt quite isolated. And that's when the sense of purpose maybe isn't quite so great. So whilst we knew we were doing something that the government wanted us to do, I wasn't necessarily having that sort of daily contact with Iraqis to sort of, build up the resiliency you need when you're doing a job like that.
Numbers of thoughts strike me, and I've got all sorts of fireworks going off in my head at the moment in terms of keynotes that you're talking about, your career in the RAF. I mean, the training element within the fact that you're picking people and putting training into context and then moving them forward as a career, that you're looking at the psychology, that you're looking at how you're interrelating with the communities that you have locally. And this is sort of in addition to, the hard and fast day job, which is, you're basically, I mean, the military invented logistics. This was all about your success in any military activity was generally driven by your ability to supply to the front line, whether that be ammunition or indeed medical supplies or just simple food. You begin to get, and I mean, heaven's sake, I've done a few risky implementations, but there were no rockets going off around me. I wondered sometimes at some of the people I was interacting with, but that is not. There is no physical risk to me, and I think. To sort of do all of this, I'm imagining, somebody on a unicycle juggling going around a minefield. I mean, that's what it seems to me. We're used to the unicycle and the juggling within logistics and supply chain, but adding a minefield and a few rockets going off, and it makes it a hell of a lot more of a challenge. If we can sort of take you back, I mean, supply chain and logistics for people often isn't an obvious choice that they make. So how did you get into the wonderful world of supply chain and logistics?
To a degree, luck, but my goodness, I feel like it was the best luck in the world, because it's led me to some fascinating places, and I love the problem-solving aspect of logistics. One of my roles was, when I was more senior, was doing all logistics for defence in the Middle East, and that was amazing, where you were sort of having to plan really from factory to foxhole in quickly as possible.
That is just fantastic, because and having worked in the food industry, we talk about from field to fork, but from factory to foxhole, I think, wow, okay, I've learned something new. Thank you.
And I used to joke with the Africa team, because they would always say that, we all ran on rails in the Middle East because we'd been there for so long, but actually we all had exactly the same problems when it came to it was always the last mile, it was always the timelines, it was always the pace at which the operators wanted things to be delivered, the concept of Amazon not being replicated for impatient commanders, all the things that logisticians just become absolutely aware of. But I mean, I must admit, when I was at university, logistics wasn't a word that was thrown around. It wasn't one that I would have been able to conceptualize, but the problem-solving aspect of it, the people aspect of it, the being able to understand what it was that people needed, then actually picture that, get the people who could deliver that to recognize what they could do, was absolutely what was required. I mean, one of the reasons why the Air Force rejected me the first time round was because I only put logistics on my application. And the individual who debriefed me very glibly said, by the time you join, it'll be civilianized. So the fact that it's still not civilianized, and actually logistics in the Air Force has become more and more noticed. It has across defence, the whole line of amateurs deal in tactics, but professionals deal in logistics has become more and more true. And I think that just goes to show how important it is. And I was just so delighted that when I did apply a second time, that I ended up specialising in logistics.
What do you wish you would have known at the start of your career? You sort of know now, but you didn't then. And would it have changed anything?
There's probably quite a lot actually that I could put onto that. I think what I would just most probably say is that logistics is a continual conversation rather than thinking I've got to come up with the solution to this problem immediately and feel all the pressure of that. I would most probably take that pressure off and say, let's just keep this conversation going and realizing that actually everybody's quite interested in getting the right result. Let's make it a conversation that everybody's involved in. I think I most probably did that instinctively. So I don't know that it would change much of what I did, but I'd most probably have wanted to have been more conscious about that was the way I operated and let people know so that it was expected rather than just something that was done by instinct.
Really good answer. But the truthful answer always is a good answer. So what's one lesson your job in the RAF taught you that you think everyone should learn at some point in their life?
Gosh, I think I learned. So maybe that's it, actually. Maybe it is that you never learn everything, that you just keep learning.
That's very true. I'd hate the thought if we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a child, I was always the one where I didn't want the journey to end. I used to kick off, whether it was a bus ride, a train ride, or a ride in a car. It was, no, please, I want to continue, which used to cause my parents much degree of unhappiness, Yes, I do remember sadly wearing an anorak at that time, probably being about the age of 3. My mum would just gently pull my hair in order to be able to encourage me to, come on, move, you need to get off, this is our stop. And she forgot I had my hood up on my anorak. And so but there we go. But I don't think our journey of learning ever should stop. I think, we're gifted with these wonderful minds. And they all have potential.
Yeah.
And my sadness quite often is at my age to study, to learn, to research was a real task. It involved Dewey Decimal System, going to libraries, being able to search for things. You had to talk to people. And all of a sudden we have this miraculous... It's storms of data, hurricanes of data. It's not clouds of data. I mean, the complete weather systems of data around us. And so in theory, everything is easier. But then we have to learn how to sift and select. And that's interesting.
Yeah, it's almost a different way of applying it. And it presents its own challenges, but I personally prefer feeling out the right way of doing things rather than sort of that instant gratification of, right, this is what we're doing, let's do it. So I think that's where I'm sort of quite keen. Everyone does keep learning that, particularly as you get more senior, the moment you feel very sure and certain of something, that's most probably where you need to ask, well, what am I missing? Because usually there is something to be learned at that very moment.
Have you got an example of that?
I think was probably in trying to change the culture. A lot of my last role in the Air Force was looking at cultural change and behavioural change rather than logistics per se. Although a lot of the problems were very similar in terms of sort of mindsets. And people got it absolutely fixed in their head that it was all about recruitment. If we got the recruiting right, we would be able to improve not just gender balance, but also demographic balance across the Air Force. And the elephant in the room that no one was addressing was actually the retention issue. And so that's most probably an example, not necessarily of my own. I'd have to think really hard about my own blind spots because I know I've had to move in my time. Because particularly when I'm tired, I do like to go for the, right, that's a decision, let's get on, move.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Quite often, this sort of prevarication or the inability, the indecisiveness, and you almost say, oh, for heaven's sake, just give me a wrong decision, we'll work with it.
Yeah.
And leadership is difficult. I absolutely acknowledge that. And For me, I think we should allow our leaders to be vulnerable on occasion and not have all the answers.
Yeah, it's that's music to my ears to hear that, because I think there is a lot of pressure on people to appear as if they know, and then they get entrenched, and suddenly you find you can't make a different decision. Yeah.
Yeah. You find that people sort of defend ego, or you can see the wall being built in front of you.
Yeah, suddenly the rational risk overrides every other risk, and you're like, hold on a moment.
Yeah, it's actually okay to be human. Is the one. Who's inspired you most in your career and why?
I think at different times I've been inspired by all sorts of different people. This is not a political point, but as a child, you couldn't help, I think, as a young child in Britain, being inspired by having a female prime minister. Whilst I recognise controversial politics, I do think Margaret Thatcher was hugely inspiring as a leader, and seeing what she could do. But actually, I've always been really inspired by kind leadership as well, people who can be genuinely human whilst they lead. And that's a type of leadership that I really love to see, and I'm sort of trying to think of specific role models who other people would know. I was very lucky to have one of those teachers when I was at school, a headmaster called Clive Ashby, who was incredibly human whilst being very respected as a leader. And in the Air Force, a number of different individuals who just kept my motivation going and my energy going. And all of them were most probably flawed heroes. I recognise that not everyone's able to be perfect all the time. But I've also been really massively inspired by sporting stars as well. So someone like Paula Radcliffe, who had just her determination, her tenacity, even when things weren't going right, to keep going. And that type of person always inspires me as well.
I mean, to have our first female prime minister, I realise, for some people that can be divisive, but I think most people would agree that the effort put in and the homework being done, and whether or not you agreed or disagreed, pretty much, as she said, so shall you got, and that to me would be a refreshing change to perhaps what we experience now. And
as a young girl, it just made me think that I could be anything. It really did make me think, well, and not consciously at all. This was just, I was a toddler, I think, when she sort of became prime minister. It's like, well, why can't women do anything if we've got a female prime minister?
And I think that's an incredible positive message. There possibly is a case to answer in terms of her own promotion of the female role within leadership and governments, because I think I think she preferred the company of men generally.
And in terms of her leadership, I now recognise that actually she was either comfortable or masking as a man fundamentally. So I would pull some parts of that to pieces, at this stage in my life.
But it is interesting because we're the product of the society that is around us, and so I always think this is the duality, and what we don't, let's say as an electorate, we don't take our own responsibility to actually be interested, to get ourselves informed, and to make better judgments. Instead of which, it's a bit like that, make any decision, Yes. I think we've got to become not cynical because it's negative. I think we need to become testing and skeptical in everything that we do, no matter what your political colour is. I think we need to become more interested and engaged, which isn't a popular thing perhaps to say.
No, and I do think that ability to think critically, to critique things is really, but particularly with the amount of disinformation now that's out there, it's really important to think, where is the source of this information? Who is it who's making me think wants me to think like that? And that's again, going back to what you were saying about how people learn now, what the learning process is. it's almost a different environment and context out there for people to try and navigate.
It is fascinating. Doubtless we'll come up with solutions. What are you most proud of?
Then all sorts of things. I keep saying that. I think it's got to be my 20s. Actually, no, I think it's my decision to leave the Air Force, because I was very comfortable. I knew what my career was going to be if I stayed in, and it was one that I would have greatly enjoyed and would have seen me progress. But the fact that I actually thought, no, I want to challenge myself and I want to have a second career, is at the moment the thing I'm most proud of. You might want to get back to me in a few years' time and see whether I feel the same. But at the moment, that is definitely what I'm proud of.
On the basis of what I've heard today and the previous conversations that we have, because we always put some prep in sort of ahead of a podcast, I'm absolutely sure you're going to give wonderful value to people. And I genuinely encourage people to reach out to Debs and have a conversation, because that experience from an RAF basis, I mean, you just go on LinkedIn, do a bit of LinkedIn stalking like I did, and go and really have a look at what Debs has managed to achieve in terms of a career as far as the RAF. And then imagine putting that into a more commercial context. Our military do difficult things, and they put their own lives at risk in terms of what they do. And they certainly are by me and should be honoured by all and thanked for the service that they bring. The fact that they can do it in such an intricate and intelligent manner these days, I think, is perhaps lost on the general listener. I think, the more that I hear it, it really is at the most sophisticated end of how you run an organisation. And there are, often it is said, okay, let's privatise it. The industry's got more experience. And I actually think at the moment the balance is in, from a logistics and supply chain basis, I think the balance is more than teetering. I'll put it that way and allow people to draw their own conclusions as to where I think it's falling. So thinking forward, I want to think in two ways forward. One is your view, and if we could take more of a, perhaps without breaking the Official Secrets Act or anything like that, that in terms of looking at the future of military supply chain and logistics in perhaps 5, 10, 20 years' time, did you see any trends that you can talk about that you can say, well, okay, this is where we're going to go to? Because clearly within more civilian logistics, there are some key trends within the. Are they sort of echoed within military logistics as you see it, or are they amplified?
I think they're definitely echoed, and I think the military is trying to learn more and more from industry and the civilian sector in a way that I think is becoming more joined up and natural, which is only helpful, I think, from both aspects. I think that's most probably the greatest trend that I saw by the time I left, was actually this general partnership between industry and the military. I think that was developing definitely sort of in terms of the factory side and nearer to the factory side of military logistics. I think the other trend, though, that I would recognise is that the foxhole part, the last mile, is actually more and more focused on military. I think that is where the vast majority of the military expertise comes into its own. So whether that's trying to get munitions out to the Middle East and store them, in the very, very hot heat out there, or whether it's things like the cool chain for blood, to get that to the very front line in a way that is still fit for use and fit for purpose. I think that last mile will always stay military, and is most probably where the focus of military and operational logistics will be for quite some time. But anything behind that first mile, I think partnership with industry is definitely the trend that is going to keep developing.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're sort of drawing to the end of the interview, which I've enjoyed greatly, Debs, and thank you. I often concern myself about the use of risk management in pretty much everything that I do, really as a business. It's always been absolutely key. Is that the same within, let's say, the RAF for what you do? It must be magnified, surely, in terms of the way that you're looking at how you achieve something. Because if you fail, all right, if in the past, if I would have failed, and it can cause a riot, but there might not have been bread on the shelves of a supermarket, or somebody might have been complaining about they can't buy the right variety of baked beans, which is Heinz, by the way, or indeed, whatever else that they didn't have. But for you, it is, if it goes wrong, it really does go wrong.
Yes. Yeah. I do really remember out in Iraq needing to get 2 Land Rovers into a Hercules, and it was a very, very complicated load. But we knew we were having to close the airfield in half an hour. And if these Land Rovers didn't fly, then an operation couldn't happen the next day, where they were crucial. So you were always aware of the risk. And we used to always, when you're just delivering on the front line, you tend to just get on with it and hope that other people have, you're there doing the tactical risk assessment of keeping people safe. And that was also my job, was to actually step back and make sure that people were physically safe.
Sure. In
the planning phases, you're always having that balance of operational risk, reputational risk, financial risk as well, which was coming into it. I think the military I joined did play slightly more fast and loose with the risk, but definitely it's become a part of all the planning processes and all the operations. And you've always got to be sort of thinking, so where is my own risk balance here? Am I being too risk averse? Am I being too cautious? And that's why having diversity of opinion is so important, is that you're actually not missing any risks, and you aren't going into that group think of, let's just get on with this and deliver. It's having it looking around, but someone at some point has got to make a decision. And that's where the accountability, the authority have to be aligned, so that you know who is taking the risk and they actually know what the risk is that they're taking.
Thank you so much. Again, no time to go through methodology. That's a slightly geeky part of what I enjoy looking at. So I'm not going to make you suffer the pain of that. But in the last couple of minutes of the interview, I'd like to focus on giving advice to people considering, a career in supply chain and logistics. And then obviously people forget that there's a military option in terms of supply chain and logistics within here. So do you think it's a good idea for people to consider logistics, supply chain, or indeed a military, in terms of a forward career?
I think logistics is a fascinating career. I think actually, as technology changes and advances, I think it's human beings being involved in logistics is going to be more and more important. So I would definitely say to people, supply chain logistics, scratch under the surface and see what it is, because I think when you do, you'd be really, really intrigued. And I would always encourage people to have a look at the military as well. I can't say it's for everybody, but if you are the right person for the military and the military is right for you, you will absolutely have an incredible time, and you'll do things that you would never experience in civilian life.
So if somebody was just starting out and was interested in a career in logistics and supply chain, what do you think they should do?
Go and talk to people who are, they're actually in the career at the moment, aren't they?
No. It's somebody just starting out and saying, well, okay, I'm really, I don't know what to do, What are my options?
And I go and talk to people who are doing those jobs. Look at something that you're interested in, because all areas are connected to logistics. So whether you're actually interested in retail, whether you're interested in food, whether it's, going to gigs or something, go and have a look at what's happening behind the sscenes, and have a look.
I could see you doing an events logistics company. I really could.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to. I love stuff like the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Looking at the logistics of how that was achieved, it just makes my heart sing. It really does. And I suppose I like the unsung hero part of logistics as well. I love the fact that you can put, sweat, blood and tears to deliver something, sit back and you're successful if no one notices what you've done.
That is so true. Having said that, they do scream blue bloody murder if effectively things go wrong.
Yes.
And I think that's fascinating. I always I still call logistics the home of blame, and our talent in terms of being great logisticians is always to get to root cause.
Yeah.
And it rarely is logistics, actually, but there we go. Debs, it has been such a pleasure. I wish you so much good fortune in terms of your new venture. I really would encourage anybody to engage with you, because the good counsel, the approachability, the wisdom, you don't have to scratch the surface very much to actually understand what a Diamond Debs is. So Diamond Debs, oh no, that's going to stick.
That's a first. Oh no, thank you. I'm right back at you. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And if anyone does want to reach out on LinkedIn, please do. But no, thank you for the opportunity to talk and to find out more about you as well. It's been absolutely wonderful. I've loved it.
Thank you very much, Debs. So that's it from this podcast. Just a reminder, you can catch up with all the previous episodes of the Logistics Collective podcast on our website, logisticscollective.com, or wherever you get your podcasts from, and remember to click follow and we'll let you know when the next episode is released. Until next time, bye for now.
You can get in contact by email, podcast@logisticscollective.com, or leave a voice message on our website, logisticscollective.com. The podcast is a production by Le Guru.